Okay, it's 2 o'clock. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for Fair Housing Coach's Coffee Break Quiz. Today's quiz is on parking related accommodation requests. And I'd like to just remind everyone that we are doing a quiz format, so we won't be taking questions from the audience. I don't know if you can see this here, but if you have any questions at all for future webinars or questions about this webinar, you can send them to me after the program at hstone@thehabitatgroup.com. And again, I'm Heather Stone, Executive Editor of the Habitat Group, publisher of Fair Housing Coach. And today's speaker, not sure if I'm moving our video around here, is Lynn Wilson, and she is partner at Goggans, Stutzman, Hudson, Wilson, and Mize, LLP in Atlanta. She initiated and manages the firm's landlord-tenant practice, which represents landlords and property management companies of single-family investment portfolios, as well as multifamily, manufactured home communities, and commercial property owners. As an integral part of the firm's landlord-tenant practice, she provides assistance to clients in formulating best practices in the operation and management of the rental portfolio. To that end, she routinely provides recommendations regarding lease forms, addendums, vendor purchase agreements, lien waivers, service provider agreements, property management agreements, and other documents needed to ensure her clients are in compliance with statutes, regulations, and local ordinances. And today we're talking about fair housing compliance. Quick legal disclaimer. This webinar offers general information only and is not intended as legal advice. Viewing the webinar does not create an attorney-client relationship with the speaker or the firm she represents. And for legal advice on specific issues, please contact a local attorney in your area. Okay, and now I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see us properly. Here we are. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. And I'm going to ask a series of questions, 5 questions on parking related requests you might get from people with disabilities. And I will launch our first poll question here. Question number 1. Several months after moving into your community, a resident tells you she's disabled and asks you to reserve for her an accessible parking space near her unit. You may deny the request because she didn't ask for the space when she moved in. True or false? I'll give folks some time to answer. And your answers are all anonymous. Okay. I'm going to end the polling and let's see what people said. Okay, 99% said false and 1% said true. So I'll read the question one more time. Several months after moving into your community, a resident tells you she's disabled and asks you to reserve for her an accessible parking space near her unit. You may deny the request because she didn't ask for the space when she moved in. Lynn, true or false?
That is false. You cannot deny the request because she didn't ask for the space when she moved in. It's important to understand that under the Fair Housing Act, the landlord must make reasonable accommodations for a disabled resident to allow parking closest to the unit. This is not considered a modification under the ADA. It's considered an accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. There's voluminous case law out there now in the market that speaks very clearly to this issue, that upon a tenant's request, that accommodation must be genuinely investigated and in more instances than not granted. It would be very much the exception to not grant the request without violating fair housing.
Okay, everyone did very well on that. Let's move on to number 2. Your building has unassigned parking. An applicant says he wants an assigned space near the entrance due to a disability. He doesn't use a cane or seem to have any difficulty walking, but you could trigger fair housing trouble if you ignore his request. True or false? Okay, we'll give people a few moments here to answer. Okay, I'm going to stop. Oh, nope, some late answers coming in. Okay, now I will end the poll and let's see. 92% said true and 8% said false. Lynn, what do you say?
I say true. You could trigger a fair housing complaint if you ignore the request. First of all, it's important to understand that the way fair housing defines disability, it doesn't necessarily have to be a disability that is apparent to you as you look at that prospective tenant or tenant. Start with that. Secondly, the fact that they are requesting, that person is requesting the accommodation, means that you have an obligation to undertake a reasonable effort to determine what the accommodation that needs to be made. I would say the burden is always on the landlord or owner or property manager to show that they conducted a reasonable determination as to granting that tenant an accommodation with regard to parking. And I would say, without probably much reservation, 9 times out of 10, you ought to err on the side of giving that accommodation. You can request some additional information on the disability, but you can't invade that tenant's privacy. You can't request any more information than the tenant is willing to provide you. So you walk a very fine line here. And I think erring on the side of providing that accommodation at the end of the day is a far more appropriate response than denying it.
Right. Okay, very good. Let's move on to question 3. A resident with a disability complains that the accessible parking space nearest her unit is often used by visitors with disabilities. She asks you to stop others from using it. You should put up a sign marking the space reserved for S. Smith, Unit 5A only. True or false? And I'll read the question one more time. A resident with a disability complains that the accessible parking space nearest her unit is often used by visitors with disabilities. She asks you to stop others from using it. You should put up a sign marking the space reserved for S. Smith, Unit 5A only. And I will end polling, and let's see, 90% said false, 10% said true. Lynn, what do you say?
I agree that with the 90% that this is, you should not put up a sign marking the space reserved for S. Smith, number 5A only. And there are a couple issues at play, I think, in this question. One is if you have accessible parking available in the development, it is clear that an accommodation under fair housing is not simply renaming that accessible parking space to a designated individual. That accessible parking has to remain accessible parking as it was originally determined in the development of the unit. And that really covers the ADA as much as it covers fair housing. But I also think that it is not acceptable to designate publicly the parking space that particular spot is designated for. I think that if it's marked as, disabled, whatever, it's marked for handicap parking and someone else parks in it, it is certainly enforceable as to the person violating that tenant's right to use that space, but you don't call out the tenant by designating it that way.
Okay, very good. Okay, we're moving on to question 4. And this one, launch, I didn't have a lot of space to to put the whole question in the top. So it looks like there are 3 answers here. There are really only 2, true or false. I will read it now. And I also have to embellish what's here on the screen. So listen carefully, please. Tanya, who has a mobility disorder, asks for a reserved space closest to the building entrance, but the space she wants is reserved for Sharon, who also has disabilities. You offer Tanya another space, but she says she's more impaired than her neighbor and demands the closest space. To avoid fair housing trouble, you should give Tanya what she wants. True or false? And I'll read that again. Tanya, who has a mobility impairment, asks for a reserved space closest to the building entrance, but the space she wants is reserved for Sharon, another resident with disabilities. You offer Tanya another space, but she says she's more impaired than her neighbor and demands the closest space. To avoid fair housing trouble, you should give her what she wants. True or false? Okay, I'll give you a few more seconds here. And I'll close this. Wow, okay, 100% said false. Lynn, what do you say?
I say false. It does denying acts or the fair housing does not ever put you in a position of leveraging one person's disability against another person's disability. And that's what this particular question seems to be suggesting that the property manager should consider doing. What the property manager or owner's responsibility is to accommodate the first tenant in the best way that property management or owner can possibly accommodate them without sacrificing the needs of the individual who does have the spot at this point closest to the entrance.
Okay. Question 5. A resident requests an assigned accessible space near his unit as an accommodation to his disability. To add the space, you'll have to install curb cuts and repaint the lot. Since this is a reasonable modification, you can charge him for the work. True or false? A resident requests an assigned accessible space near his unit as an accommodation to his disability. To add the space, you'll have to install curb cuts and repaint the lot. Since this is a reasonable modification, you can charge him for the work. True or false? Okay, a few more seconds. I'm going to end the polling. Okay, here 35% said true and 65% said false. Lynn, what do you say?
So I think this is a trick question.
It is a trick question.
You're right, because what it does is it sort of mixes fair housing with ADA. In fair housing, we're looking at accommodation. In the ADA, we look at reasonable modifications. In this instance, there is case law that states very clearly that under fair housing, a landlord's obligation or owner to install curb cuts, paint parking is an accommodation and not a reasonable modification. You cannot request that that tenant pay for it because it is not a modification that falls under the ADA. It is a reasonable accommodation for that tenant. And there's actually a very recent case in 2020 that speaks very clearly to this, in that the court asserted in agreeing with the tenant that but for the fact that the landlord wasn't going to make that reasonable accommodation, that tenant would not be able to fully use and enjoy that rental and therefore might not be able to live there. And that is a flat out violation of fair housing.
Okay, very good. Well, that was 5 questions, and I think we came in right at 15 minutes. Oh, well done. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and thank you so much, Lynn, for giving us the answers today.
You're welcome. Thank you for letting me have the opportunity.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, and join us again in the future for another Fair Housing Coach Coffee Break Quiz. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye. Take care.